Hi everyone, I'm Jack from Rack and Turn. I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on the Blue Octavo notebooks by Franz Kafka. This is an extraordinary collection of his writings. These were written for about a year and a half at a period where he had paused writing for the most part in his diaries. Now these have sort of been making the rounds on BookTube. These are justifiably famous. They provide an incredible insight into the personality of Kafka, into his experiences, and really what was shaping the individual who was creating some of the greatest works of the 20th century literature. But the Blue Octavo notebooks are almost these little private messages from Kafka. That if Kafka had an account on Twitter or X, this is what we would see. They are aphorisms. Many of them are little fragments, the sentence in the middle of a story, at the beginning of a story, something that an image that captured Kafka's imagination that he wanted to record for his own use. Now, a number of these have been published. A number of the aphorisms have been collected and were sort of included as an appendix in one collection of his stories that was published. A couple of these are sort of collected as considered microfictions. It's an entire parable in a sense that is there for made up of 4 to 8 sentences. And so some of these have been around, but it's interesting to see how those are inserted into these tiny moments. Kafka rarely makes a notation of date. He rarely makes a notation of what's going on in his life. About the only ones we see are when during World War I, there was a ceasefire between Russia and Austria-Hungary and the German Empire, and later on when a treaty is signed to end the war with Russia. But that's about it. Almost everything else, there's periodically a mention of someone going to dinner or going to a theater. And he has some longer stories in here that aren't perhaps quite complete. But what is in this book is quite fascinating. He notes, the history of the world as it is written and handed down by word of mouth often fails us completely. But man's intuitive capacity, though it often misleads, does lead, does not ever abandon one. And so, for instance, the tradition of the 7 wonders of the world has always had associated with it the rumor that there was an 8th wonder of the world. And concerning this 8th wonder, there were various, perhaps contradictory statements made, the vagueness of which was explained by the obscurity of ancient times. And that's in the second notebook, but there's a sense in which that's almost the philosophy of a good number of these aphorisms, of these parables, of these fragments, of what was just filling Kafka's mind as he was noting down these entries in his Blue Octavo notebooks. There's a sense that there's a failure in what he is recording, that each of these little fragments he's going to record, most of them will never become anything. And there's a sense in which he was never perhaps intending for any of these to be made public. There is a privacy. These are just flashes of insight in his mind that were important in the moment to him. And we see that he never did go back and develop many of these into anything more substantial. It's that single flash, that spark that's critical. But we do have other fascinating explorations of our reality, of our perception. Seen with the terrestrial sullied eye, we are in the situation of travelers in a train that has met with an accident in a tunnel, and this at a place where the light of the beginning can no longer be seen, and the light of the end is so very small a glimmer that the gaze must continually search for it and is always losing it again. And furthermore, both the beginning and the end are not even certainties. Round about us, however, in the confusion of our senses, or in the supersensitiveness of our senses, we have nothing but monstrosities and a kaleidoscopic play of things that is either delightful or exhausting, according to the mood and injury of each individual. What shall I do? Or why should I do it? Are not questions to be asked at such places. And so we start to get a sense of Kafka's individuality. But one of the aspects of these that are critical is that a number of the entries are written in this first person, whether it's plural we or individual singular I. And this is a crucial aspect of the Blue Octavo notebooks. Kafka does not sit down and say, this was a thought I had, or this was a dream I had, or this is a story I'm writing in the first person. And so the experiences are filtered through his mind and through his perception, but do they necessarily constitute Kafka's point of view? That I think is one of the great adventures within the Blue Octavo notebooks, short as they are, is trying to identify, okay, is this something that I think Kafka himself really stands firm on? Or is this something that Kafka is presenting through a fictional memory or a fictional fragment for us to consider, even though he doesn't necessarily agree with it. He just thinks it's an interesting idea. And so I think that is part of what's really interesting about these notebooks. Immediately after that, he writes, many shades of the departed are occupied solely in licking at the waves of the river of death, because it flows from our direction and still has the salty taste of our seas. Then the river rears back in disgust. The current flows the opposite way and brings the dead drifting back into life. But they are happy, sing songs of thanksgiving, and stroke the indignant waters. There's something that is viscerally uncomfortable in a number of these fragments, aphorisms, parables, just as there is within Kafka's writing in his fiction. The worries that are the burden of which the privileged person makes an excuse in dealing with the oppressed person are, in fact, the worries about preserving his privileged condition. And so there are moments where Kafka is just laying it right out there. He also has an absolute fascination with the concept of paradise, of the Garden of Eden, from traditions he had grown up in with the Hebrew Bible, and he writes about those, but also growing up in Prague, within Austria-Hungary, and seeing, and later on the Czechoslovakia, but seeing sort of a Christian culture and its traditions around paradise. And so he writes, if what is supposed to have been destroyed in paradise was destructible, then it was not decisive. But if it was indestructible, then we are living in a fake belief. Immediately after that, true undoubting is the teacher's part, continual undoubting the part of the pupil. But from there, then, we begin to see just his absolute fascination with paradise. He writes in this third notebook, and this is probably my favorite of the I believe there's 8 notebooks. He writes within this whole series of entries about paradise. He goes, we are separated from God on 2 sides. The fall separates us from him. The tree of life separates him from us. Later, we are sinful not only because we have eaten of the tree of knowledge, but also because we have not yet eaten of the tree of life. The state in which we are is sinful, irrespective of guilt. We were expelled from paradise, but it was not destroyed. The expulsion from paradise was in one sense a piece of good fortune, for if we had not been expelled, paradise would have had to be destroyed. Another one, we were created in order to live in paradise, and paradise was ordained to serve us. What was ordained for us has been changed. It is not said that this has also happened with what was ordained for paradise. Again, almost right to the end of the account of the fall, it remains possible that the Garden of Eden will be cursed together with mankind. Only mankind is accursed. The Garden of Eden is not. On the day he ate of the tree of knowledge, God said that Adam would have to die. According to God, the instant consequence of eating from the tree of knowledge was to be death. According to the serpent, at least it could be understood in this sense, it was to mean becoming like God. Both were wrong in similar ways. Men did not die, but became mortal. They did not become like God, but received an indispensable capacity to become so. Both were also in similar ways correct. It was not man that died, but paradisical man. He did not become God, but knowledge of the divine. And then he goes, finally, the evil one's desolate field of vision. In the very fact of recognizing good and evil, he believes he sees equality with God. The curse does not seem to make anything in his nature worse. He will measure out the length of the road on his belly. And so there are all of these numerous entries on paradise, this fascination that seems to have occurred for Kafka over the course of, it's perhaps unclear, was it a single day? Was it a couple of days? There's an entry on January 18th, and there's another entry dated January 22nd. So somewhere in those 4 days, Kafka had these ideas, or perhaps he went back and added one. And we don't know how quickly these ideas tumbled upon him, or if it was something he was really just focused on over the weekend. And how much of this, again, did he feel was like absolutely true in the moment, absolutely true for eternity, such that he would consider it? Or were these all moments and parables and fragments that he wanted to work with? I tend towards believing that a number of these were really statements he felt, like in his bones felt. But perhaps these were just passages and sentences he wanted to include in a story at some point. Before that, though, we have a microfiction that's been published along with some of his stories, Prometheus. There are 4 legends about Prometheus. According to the first, because he had betrayed the gods to men, he was chained to a rock in the Caucasus, and the gods sent eagles that devoured his perpetually renewed liver. According to the second, Prometheus in his agony as the beaks hacked into him. pressed deeper and deeper into the rock until he became one with it. According to the third, in the course of thousands of years, his treachery was forgotten. The gods forgot. The eagles forgot. He himself forgot. According to the fourth, everyone grew weary of what had become meaningless. The gods grew weary. The eagles grew weary. The wound closed wearily. What remained was the inexplicable range of mountains. Legend tries to explain the inexplicable. Since it arises out of a foundation of truth, it must end in the realm of the inexplicable. And as much as that's this incredible, parable, this that draws on myth and tries to work in this meaning, this significance, there's something about Kafka where he is very clearly working through ideas, and how he views so much of experience, so much of myth from his very singular and unique perspective. How does Kafka see himself fitting into this idea? And so he goes within that third notebook back to paradise later, about a week later. There were three possible ways of punishing man for the fall. The mildest was the way actually used, expulsion from paradise. The second was destruction of paradise. The third, and this would have been the most terrible punishment of all, was the cutting off of life everlasting and leaving everything as it was. He notes at the end of that notebook, expulsion from paradise was thus not an act, but a happening. And so we have these just absolutely fascinating reflections from Kafka. And that's why when I would recommend reading the Blue Octavo notebooks, it's an insight into the core of his truth. It's not the core of his experiences, as I said in the diary. It's not his personality, who he went to the theater with, the arguments he had with his parents. It's not the passionate letters or the recriminating letters that he wrote privately, to whether to Mylena or to his father. It's not that side of Kafka. These are rather these sparks, these snapshots. Kafka basically dropping into a photo booth, pressing the button, saying one thing, and that's what he's pasting into this book. That's these scraps, a scrapbook of a sense, but it's a scrapbook of one of the most unique and creative minds, someone who was constantly taking reality and shaping it into something that he could feel a little closer to understanding, while accepting that he would never completely understand it. And so I'll close with some passage from the fourth notebook that I think really get into that idea. He has a whole series of ideas on death, but before that he writes in a very long passage about this sense of how he feels. It is not inertia, ill will, awkwardness, even there's something of all this in it, because vermin is born of the void, that caused me to fail, or even not even to get near failings. Family life, friendship, marriage, profession, literature. It is not that, but the lack of ground underfoot, of air, of the commandment. It is my task to create these, not in order that I may then, as it were, catch up with what I have missed, but in order that I shall have missed nothing. For the task is as good as any other. It is indeed the most primal task of all, or at least the reflection of that task, just as one may, on climbing to heights where the air is thin, suddenly step into the light of the far distant sun. And this is no exceptional task either. It is sure to have been set often before. True, I don't know whether it has ever been set to such a degree. I have brought nothing with me of what life requires, so far as I know, but only the universal human weakness. With this, in this respect, it is gigantic strength. I have vigorously absorbed the negative element of the age in which I live, an age that is, of course, very close to me, which I have no right ever to fight against, but as it were, a right to represent. The slight amount of the positive, and also of the extreme negative, which capsizes into the positive, are something in which I have had no hereditary share. I have not been guided into life by the hand of Christianity, admittedly now slack and failing, as Kierkegaard was, and have not caught the hem of the Jewish prayer shawl, now flying away from us, as the Zionists have. I am an end or a beginning. And what an incredible just insight and a knife just cutting at the heart of who Kafka felt himself to be in moments. I personally think that's an entry that is coming from Kafka. That is coming from this fire at the back of him that's springing out, not just the beginning to some story. There's a sense of truth to that and what we've seen in his diaries and what we know about his life. But subsequently, he had a whole series of reflections on death. The cruelty of death lies in the fact that it brings the real sorrow of the end, but not the end. The lamentation around the deathbed is actually the lamentation over the fact that here no dying in the true sense has taken place. We must still content ourselves with this sort of dying. We are still playing the game. Our salvation is death, but not this one. And that is really the Kafka that we are able to catch in the Blue Octavo notebooks. The person who can write single sentences that have as much truth behind them, if not perhaps in them, but have as much personal truth behind them as we'll find in any writer of the 20th century and standing up with writers across time, as we'll see in the recommended if you like. But there is something special within these, that Kafka was writing these for himself. And there's an idea that perhaps he would one day share some of these reflections with the world. But these were for him. These were what he was seeing when he looked in the mirror, I think. And so I'd highly, highly recommend them. And now, of course, a lot of folks are dipping into the diaries. I have been, and there is much to appreciate and enjoy in these. These provide a much more round shape. If these are the snapshots from Kafka, what he sees when he looks in the mirror, this is much more three-dimensional. There's a depth to many of these entries. There are passages, where we can see him beginning fiction or working out fictions, especially early on, some of the earlier stories he wrote, and his frustrations that he shares with specific works in his diaries, those frustrations he has with people that are absent from the Blue Octavo notebooks. For this 18-20-month period, he really was just sort of sharing these moments. That was all he felt capable of writing down. As I had mentioned, a number of the entries in here have been collected. There's also, if you're a fan of the Poseidon microfiction, there's sort of something that is a flash of the Poseidon microfiction that is really quite interesting. Now, from there, I started thinking about other writers who created these types of aphorisms. So one of the first ones I thought of were, of course, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. I'm not the largest fan of those. I think it's useful to encounter them. They have certainly informed a lot of other writers, thinkers, individuals, even in the present. They seem to be perpetually popular for the past, I don't know, certainly within my lifetime, and I think the 20th century, they've been a mainstay. And yet the truth of Marcus Aurelius perhaps underlies so much of what he was writing in his meditations, unlike the truth of Kafka informing what he was writing, how he was experiencing life, suffering from tuberculosis, feeling very isolated and alienated. That truth, I think, bolsters the parables and aphorisms he writes. But I was also thinking of, certainly from an aphoristic perspective, before Kafka, we have the Pensees of Pascal, but especially, I think, Nietzsche with Beyond Good and Evil, Ecce Homo, not so much Zarathustra, but especially, I would say, Beyond Good and Evil. The way that each of them would write these very quick, pithy aphorisms, even when Kafka would disagree with them, I think that's the type of thinking he was engaging in when he was composing the notebooks. A different type of a sort of aphoristic, laying it all out there writing, would be what we find in the Chronikas of Clarice Lispector. So Too Much of Life collects the complete Chronikas. I know there's a selected version of some of the best, but in these were articles she was writing on Saturdays that were published on Saturdays. So she would just, over a period of about 4 or 5 years, write out, sometimes it might just be a single paragraph, sometimes it might be a page or two, and sometimes it might be one article that she was going to include. It might be a series of 3 to 5 that she would include, just flashes of insight, thoughts she was having about what she was reading, about her life experiences she was encountering, that she felt were worth sharing. And that's there's a real truth and depth to these that I think is, if you enjoyed Agua Viva, these are really close as well. But this gets towards what Kafka was doing, sort of through a different window. I think that is sort of similarly reflected in something like the Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa, where this, again, seems to have been sort of his private trunk of entries. The idea that he is writing these as one of his heteronyms, but perhaps there's a core of truth, a sense that this is what he was seeing when he was looking in the mirror. The repetitious sense to certain ideas, the way Kafka works through paradise or works through death just over and over and over. Pessoa does the same thing in the book of Disquiet, where he repeats himself, he comes back. And it should be noted, Marcus Aurelius does the same thing in the Meditations. That's why I don't recommend reading any of these sort of just slamming through them 100 pages a day, because they are repeated. It becomes a very unpleasant reading experience. I think we lose the power of coming back and looking at the same idea just from a different perspective, revisiting our favorite paintings or sculptures, our favorite landscapes in nature. Much earlier example of this would be The Book of My Life by Girolamo Cardano. In a sense, the version of these writers from the Renaissance. Someone who would write a quick few entries on why is it useful to be active? Why is it useful to think about certain things? And just one after another. Similarly, probably one of the strongest readers of Kafka would be Elias Canetti. And so grabbing sort of a reader and anthology of Canetti's writings allows one to see the numerous ways I think Kafka influenced Canetti. Couple of other writers who I think move in some different ways. Seneca, in a number of his tragedies, would provide these aphoristic lines, these single little passages where he would note something that seems important, and where each line would be sort of a little thing. Could any heavier woe be brought to him than to destroy him so? What, think you this outrage did end so well? The horror of the fact, the greatest grief, the massacre, the terror is to tell. Where each line is sort of providing some other little quick saying that could be shared. But then we also have writers who were writing fairly explicitly from a spiritual perspective. And so we have the sort of aphoristic nature of the Dhammapada, the sayings from the Buddha. We have the Analects of Confucius. We have the sayings of the Desert Fathers. And the way that each of these is from a very particular spiritual background, but the nature of the aphorism is very comparable to where I think Kafka was pushing himself towards. In a sense, he was providing a 20th century companion to what these other writers and thinkers were doing throughout history, whether it's the parables of Jesus collected in the Gospels, or the more wisdom sayings in the Hebrew Bible, whether in Proverbs or in Ecclesiastes. These feel close to where Kafka was reaching towards. Two final thinkers that I think compare well. One would be Giacomo Leopardi in the Zibaldone, which is just this enormous, almost 2,000 page series of sort of private reflections and on culture, history, truth, spirituality, all of these different ideas that he collected. And then a sort of different vibe would be The Tragedy of Man by Madách Imre, a Hungarian playwright and writer. And this is from the 19th century, and it really digs into some of the same ideas Kafka was working towards. Obviously, very different cultural experiences, even though both were residing within what, during Kafka's lifetime was the Austria-Hungary. But the way that they approach specifically the ideas around the fall and paradise, the way that they wanted to use that to explore their world, the experiences within it, and I think the real use of reading Kafka, reading someone like Madách or even Nietzsche, any of these writers, is to start to look at our unique experiences and be able to perhaps shift our perspective to see what we are experiencing from the way they would have perceived it, and then reconcile ourselves to that, or argue against it, and remain where we are, or perhaps to move somewhere a little off from where we were before we read it, and to now have a new reflection upon those experiences. So let me know if you've read these Octavo notebooks from Kafka. I know there's so many different ways to approach his writing and the different ways in which he was trying to express his life. So I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.